Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar in our Energy Saving Trust webinar series, It's Time to Decarbonize. Today, we'll be discussing how to decarbonize your housing portfolio, planning for EPC C and the net zero carbon transition. My name is Nora, and I work for Energy Saving Trust alongside my colleagues, Gordon and Sean, whom you'll be meeting shortly. A bit of housekeeping before we start. The webinar will be recorded. We have a British Sign Language interpreter with us today, Nicole, who will be here for the duration of the webinar. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar by using the questions box, and we'll be answering these at the end of the webinar in the Q&A section. If you'd like to have a chat with our team and ask questions specifically about your organization, please fill out the form in the chat and we can set up a conversation. So to give you a bit of background, Energy Saving Trust is an independent organization dedicated to promoting energy efficiency, low carbon transport, and sustainable energy use. We aim to address the climate emergency and deliver the wider benefits of clean energy as we transition to net zero. We empower householders to make better choices, deliver transformative programs for governments, and support businesses with strategy, research, and assurance, enabling everyone to play their part in building a sustainable future. I will now hand over to Gordon to get us started.
Thanks, Nora. Good morning, everybody. My name is Gordon Watts. I'm Technical Manager Low Carbon at Energy Saving Trust. I come from a background of managing retrofit in a social housing organisation, so I've sat where a lot of you will be sat previously. So just to kick off, it's not so very long ago, really, that the question you'd get asked around energy performance of buildings was, what's your average SAP rating? And someone would draw a wobbly line on a graph. And that was the number that got submitted to Housemark or some such, and that was kind of the beginning and end of it. And it was very much based around one number to represent your whole portfolio. We're now in the world that all social homes need to get to minimum EPC C by 2030, not strictly in law yet, policy, but there's a strong feeling it will become law. But then that's on the road to net zero carbon performance by 2050, which is national law, but by implication will wrap in housing, all housing, not just social housing. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is the considerations for planning a retrofit program. I'm afraid I can't answer all these questions, but I can raise some of the issues that need to be addressed. And the reason I can't answer them all is because they are going to be very different for each organisation and where you're coming from and what you're hoping to achieve. So just talking around some of these issues for a few minutes. So first of all, what do we need to know about our stock? Now, I'm going to come back to this question a little bit later, but just for the moment, for a start, just to suffice to say that this goes way beyond, the SAP rating now when we're talking about retrofit. It's a rich mosaic of data that we need to pull together to inform this. I'll say I'll come back to this. The other thing is it's not just about the stock either. It's the stock and customer combination. You need to understand the customer, their situation, and which it helps influence where your priorities lie. You've then got thinking about, right, what are the sweet spot opportunities for doing this kind of work? There are a couple that stand out. One is when properties become void. It's the chance to get in to do works, and particularly when it's more invasive works, such as, for example, internal wall insulation or room and roof insulation, this kind of thing. But that is always balanced, and I've been here where you're balancing saying, right, actually you want to take that property out of circulation for a while to get these works done, balanced against rent loss. So there is always a tension there, but it is undoubtedly a great opportunity to get into properties. The other thing to think about is when you are doing planned works. So, for example, you're re-roofing a building. That might be the time to do room and roof, or think about putting on PVs. you're refitting a bathroom or kitchen, right, that's the time at which you can think about getting internal wall insulation in. And so this again comes to being able to spot those opportunities, being able to line up the data to say, actually, we're going into that property, we're doing a bathroom, yeah, now's the time to get in and do the IWI at the same time. Moving on to think about which homes do you tackle first. Now, that is very much determined by what you're trying to achieve. And again, this will be determined by what your organizational approach to this is. So, for example, if you are saying, right, we want to cut carbon as quickly as we can, you might say, well, the place to start then is with our fairly good properties, our A's, B's, maybe C's, EPC bands, and they're already good to take a heat pump. So if we will just, we'll just roll out heat pumps across those fairly good stock, the fairly good properties. Equally, you might say, well, what we're about is helping lift customers out of fuel poverty, to achieve affordable warmth. In which case, you're not thinking about heat pumps at all. You're probably thinking about insulation measures on your poorest properties. So, for example, solid wall Victorian terraces, that kind of thing. So it very much determines on what you're trying to achieve through your retrofit program. And of course, you may run multi-channels. You may be running, both of those types plus other types of retrofit in there as well to achieve multiple objectives. We then come down to that little cluster kind of 3 down the bottom there, about how do we get the biggest bang for our buck, what technical solution do we back, and what retrofit do we need to do. Starting with the what technical solution do we back, there's still some debate at the current time about hydrogen boilers versus heat pumps. And in many ways, it is attractive to hang on and hope that hydrogen boilers will come along and save the day, because it's a much less of an intervention, much less of a change for customers. You'd be taking out one box of tricks, one boiler, and putting in another boiler. You may probably wouldn't need to change radiators. It's easier for customers to understand. However, the mood music, and this is coming from people like Lord Callanan in the government, they are now, whilst there's not expected to be a decision on that until 2026, the strong mood music that you hear is that it is likely to be dominated by heat pumps with small clusters of hydrogen heated properties. Thinking about how do you get the biggest bang for your buck and what retrofit do we need to do, this is when you've identified a group of properties you want to retrofit and you get into data modeling. And so what you can do is say, right, okay, we know about that property, we know where we want to get it to, and data modeling will identify the measures that are suitable for that property, but they will also be able to identify the best value for money measures for getting that property to where it needs to be. And there's a few different systems out there that can do this kind of modeling for you. But in that way, saying, right, actually, we're all about reducing carbon. What's the quickest way to reduce carbon per pound? What's the best way to reduce customer fuel bills per pound? And you can do that kind of modeling. Finally, on this slide, thinking about stepwise or whole house and piecemeal or area-based. First of all, stepwise or whole house. In an ideal world where you had unlimited access to a property and you had unlimited budget, you would love to go in and do the preferable way to do a retrofit on a property is whole house, where you go in, you do the insulation works, the draft proofing, you move it to low carbon heating all in one go. And in some cases that may be possible. Reality is budget and access to properties mean that not always going to be possible. So you need to think about, right, okay, what are the logical steps of retrofitting a house? And what can we do now? What can we do later? And it's what can we afford to do now? The critical thing to think about that in doing that is, if you're doing a stepwise retrofit, not to do things No, it needs to be low regret. You need to be putting in measures now that you're not going to have to rewind and undo work in order to move forward again to do the next bit of retrofit. So you've always got to be thinking down the road, what comes next when I'm planning this retrofit? You've then got the question of piecemeal or area-based. Now, again, this partly relates back to what you're trying to do in terms of targets. And you're hitting your sweet spots, because you might say, well, I'm going to do it piecemeal because I'm going to pick up properties at void, and that's part of it. And that's a good approach. Equally, there is a strong, there's an increasing move to look at area-based projects, because you can create customer momentum, if you like, in an area. You can create a vibe, a buzz within an area. That this whole area is being lifted, and there's a bit more place shaping about it as well. And also there are operational efficiencies of actually you are moving from house to house in an area rather than you're dotting about, a city, for example. There are obviously drawbacks to that as well, in that you've got to get the buy-in from a wide range of customers. And sorry, it's just clean going out of my head what I was going to say about that. Mixed tenures. It's rare that we have whole neighborhoods that are solely one landlord. And so you've got private rented, you've got owner occupier, you've got possibly other landlords in there. So that is quite a difficult area to navigate at the current time. But the way it is drifting, I would say, is towards more area-based type projects. Next slide, please, Nora. I'm now moving on to talk about a little bit about people and resource. And we've very much looked about the technical data aspects and what we're trying to achieve and that kind of stuff so far. Top left, that little cluster at the top left of that slide is, do our customers understand and want this? How do we take our customers on the journey with us? Obviously, at the current time, most retrofit is with consent in customers' properties. We don't want to be in the position of, if you're trying to get people to accept retrofit and a heat pump or whatever, you don't want to be in an adversarial relationship. However, we're talking some fairly big changes, particularly when you're talking about changing heating systems. So it's the key thing I would say is you can't start early enough on customer engagement, because it's a big process. I've always said, my mantra has been, it's easy to change buildings, it's difficult to change people. So start early with that engagement. There's some really good papers, if you haven't come across them, looking at this by Place Shapers and TPAS together. They did a paper, so if you look that up on their website. And also the Northern Housing Consortium climate jury work, and they did some great work around this. And then that box in the top right hand corner is, will energy bills be affordable for our customers? Again, this kind of harks back to the technical design of your retrofit program, and that modeling can again look at, okay, what are the energy bills going to look like beforehand? What are they going to look like afterwards? Pretty much always, insulation works are always going to bring customer bills down. Heat pumps without insulation can be a bit more marginal, particularly with energy costs as they are at the current time. But that is, again, where modelling comes into this. Moving down to that little cluster in the middle about which team is responsible, who will do the work, how will we maintain this? First of all, starting with which team is responsible. Now, as I say, I come from a background working in social housing. I was a sustainability manager. So I have a very strong view on this, that this should be not the sustainability manager's job. This is asset management. It is just another element of asset management alongside damp and mold, alongside fireproofing, alongside planned works. It's just another element of asset management. And to really make a successful campaign, it's got to be one and the same. It's just asset management. Thinking about who will do the work, this is where you get into actually, do we get into a long-term relationship with contractor? And I think there is real benefit in getting to a long-term relationship with a contractor rather than hit and miss ad hoc contractors brought on for particular funding schemes, whether it's HUG or SHDF or whatever it happens to be. So there is a lot, there's getting into those long-term relationships for ongoing long-term programs, but there's also the opportunity for the sweet spot kind of moments of getting into voids, of having your own DLO, your own internal team trained up to go in and do particularly some of the simpler measures, such as loft insulation, possibly getting in, doing IWI, things that internal teams can do. So there's the opportunity to think about actually external support, but what can we do ourselves? Then the big question down the bottom is often the thought is all about getting this stuff in. And I would say start thinking early about how you're going to look after it, how you're going to maintain this once it's in. Because even things like external wall insulation, yeah, they go up. They're still going to need maintenance in due course to keep that weather seal, etc. right. Otherwise, you start getting damp problems, etc. Last thing on this slide is how are we going to pay for this? Now, it's a huge problem, and my knowledge is that if you put in the full cost of decarbonisation, it just blows most business plans out of the water at the current time. What I would say is try to program it in as a sustainable level of baseline funding within the business plan that isn't reliant on external funding, so a sustainable rate of retrofit. And then the funding that comes in externally, well, let's use SHDF as the example, that's a bonus on top, but don't predicate a plan, a program on external funding because it is so fickle. So just moving on to my last slide, it's looking at good data and insight. I've talked quite a lot about data. I've touched on this quite a few times. So what we're trying to do is create a data mosaic of information about a property and and the customer. So looking at energy performance of the building, this one up in the top left-hand corner, but this is going beyond SAP rating to the RD SAP data that lies underneath a SAP rating in the EPC. And that's giving you information on wall construction, roof construction, what's the heating, what's the boiler efficiency, of the whole complex picture. You've then got to combine this with stock condition information, because if you've got a building that's going to need significant works before it can ever take a retrofit, you can spend a lot of budget to do nothing, really, just to get a property up to standards. So you need to know that in advance. You've then got planning considerations of, right, actually, these properties we're looking at, they sit in a conservation area. So either A, it's going to limit what we can do, B, we need to start engaging with planning really early to get them on board and work through the plans with them together, or possibly both. We've then got down the bottom there, that's a guide on plan works. That's what it's meant to look like. And again, it's knowing that so that you can identify these sweet spots and get into properties. And finally, but certainly not least, is knowing about your customers, knowing where they sit in terms of their circumstances, so that you can actually, you're well positioned to target certain customer groups to achieve the maximum benefit that you want to achieve. So at that point, I'm going to pass over to Sean, who is going to talk a little bit more about the data challenge. Thank you very much. Over to you, Sean.
Thanks, Gordon. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sean Lemon, Senior Manager of Data and Digital at Energy Saving Trust, and I've been working at the intersection of retrofit, decarbonization, and data for about a decade now, so lots of experience working with social housing providers in this space. Now, building off of Gordon's discussion there on the data challenge, I'll be discussing some ways we can overcome this with good housing stock data and retrofit modeling. Now, from our experience working with social housing providers, we typically break this problem down into 3 core components or phases. So building an evidence base, exploring scenarios, and then creating a plan. Now, when we say building an evidence base, this typically involves collecting relevant data sets on the housing stock. So that could be building and energy efficiency details or socioeconomic data as well. And this information then allows us to build a housing stock database or asset management system, as Gordon was mentioning, which can be used to conduct a baseline study to understand the current conditions of the housing stock. It also enables regional benchmarking to identify unique opportunities or unique challenges for retrofit and to help evaluate progress over time. Now, once we have the evidence base in place, we can start exploring different retrofit scenarios. So this involves translating policy objectives into model parameters and then using housing stock data and energy modeling software to recommend property improvements, to estimate potential costs and savings and impacts on efficiency, as well as evaluate how well the scenario will achieve the intended targets or outcomes. Now, comparing different scenarios over time helps us to identify an optimal pathway with indicative costs and savings to achieve the end goal. And this then sets up that third phase where we can use the evidence base and the insights from the scenario modeling to inform future planning. And this can take different forms and shapes, such as regional retrofit programs, decarbonization strategies, investment plans, or local area energy plans. Next slide, please, Nora. Thanks. As I mentioned before, we've worked with a number of housing associations and local authorities of various sizes to help overcome their data challenges by moving along this journey. So given the importance of those first two phases I just mentioned, I'm going to quickly highlight two relevant products that we offer to support in that. So the first we have is Home Analytics, which is an address-level housing stock database that covers all homes in Great Britain. It includes over 95 variables of information for each property, including physical attributes such as property type, age, built form, energy efficiency measures such as insulation levels, glazing, fuel type, heating system, that kind of thing. Indicators for low carbon heating systems, so that could be suitability for air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps or solar PV. It also includes SAP characteristics such as the EPC score, energy demand, fuel bill and CO2 emissions. And then it also includes some socioeconomic indicators, so things like the index of multiple deprivation, fuel poverty statistics, and energy benefit claimant counts as well. Now, the database is populated with information collected from over 17 unique data providers, such as Ordnance Survey, Royal Mail, the EPC Register, Land Registry, Office for National Statistics, and DWP, so quite a collection of information. One of the hallmarks of the database is that it covers all properties, not just the 65% or so that have an EPC record. It's really important that we fill that gap and provide a comprehensive view of the stock. For properties that are missing data, we use a variety of statistical and spatial models to fill these gaps. And then in the database itself, we include metadata fields such as confidence levels, date stamps, and other flags that help users understand where a record has been modeled, and if so, what our confidence level is in that estimation. Now, the second product worth highlighting is our Portfolio Energy Assessment Tool, or PEAT for short. Essentially, it's an energy modeling tool that enables us to test different retrofit scenarios on batches of properties to help estimate potential costs and savings and identify an optimal pathway forward for achieving whatever the intended policy goal is. So for example, we could set a target of EPC Band C, and PEAT will then recommend a package of cost-effective measures for each property to achieve that target. Now, as Gordon mentioned before, there are similar data and modeling services out there. So if you are considering these services, we'd always advise you to do your due diligence to ensure you find a service provider that will offer value for money and deliver exactly what you need. But with that said, I'll now share an example of how we've used Home Analytics and PEAT in practice to help a group of local authorities plan for net zero and tackle some of the questions that Gordon was discussing earlier. So the case study I'll be focusing on today is West Yorkshire Combined Authority, or WYCA. In June 2019, like many other local authorities across the country, WYCA declared a climate emergency and pledged to be carbon neutral by 2038, which is a slightly more ambitious goal than the national target of 2050. To meet this goal, WYCA identified several key requirements. So they had a need for better housing stock data. They had a need to understand potential pathways for achieving net zero. They had a need to understand the costs and savings for achieving each of those pathways. They had a need to understand alternative funding models to finance decarbonization. So again, coming back to that question of how are we going to pay for this? And they also needed a targeted list of projects that local councils could focus on in the next 5 years to start making change on the ground. Now in 2021, our team was commissioned by WYCA to support this important work. The initial focus was on 3 of the 5 West Yorkshire councils, so Bradford, Calderdale, and Wakefield. Next slide, please. So to start, we scoped out the work using the same model I described earlier. So we began with building an evidence base. To do this, we provided local and combined authority users with a 5-year license for our home analytics database. So this covered all homes in the relevant geographic areas in those 3 local authorities. This information was provided in several formats to ensure different teams and users within the councils could benefit from the data. So we provided CSV extracts that could be uploaded directly into council databases, which allowed joining to other data sets that the councils held. We also provided the data as geodatabases that could be loaded into GIS software packages or programs to support mapping and spatial analysis. And we also provided bespoke Power BI dashboards that enable data filtering, exporting, and mapping. And the Power BI interface is designed to work with large data sets. So for councils with licenses, it's much easier to interact with the data via a dashboard in your web browser than in a spreadsheet with hundreds of thousands of rows that crashes every time you open it. So that was one of the key deliverables as part of this data piece. Next slide, please. So in addition to this data, we also performed an analysis of key property attributes, energy efficiency characteristics, and socioeconomic indicators within each council stock. We benchmarked these statistics against the regional and national average to help provide additional context and highlight the areas of the housing stock that might pose unique challenges or opportunities for each council. So again, by looking at the difference between region and national, you can kind of see where the stock is a bit different and might, again, have some of those unique considerations. And the insights from this analysis were shared with council representatives in the form of a stock overview PowerPoint presentation. And we found these are typically more accessible than kind of a dense report that sits on someone's desktop somewhere and doesn't necessarily make the rounds. By having it in an accessible PowerPoint with charts and maps and just kind of key findings, it's a lot easier to disseminate that information throughout the council. So it's not just the housing manager, the sustainability officer that's looking at this. It can be kind of shared more widely. Because we know housing, it's a key element of a lot of these policies that we're talking about, but it touches on health, it touches on social elements, it touches on planning. So it's important that this information is used as a resource across the council. Next slide, please. So once the evidence base was established, we then moved on to stage 2, which focused on exploring retrofit scenarios. So to do this, we worked with the WICA steering group to identify the 2 most relevant scenarios for informing their planning process. So in this case, the first scenario focused on improving all EPC band D to G homes up to EPC band C. And we called this the regulatory standard scenario. The second scenario focused on the improvements required to achieve or at least approach net zero, and we called this the high ambition scenario. Now, for each scenario we considered, we agreed on relevant parameters, such as the list of retrofit measures to consider, as well as the heating system upgrade path to apply. For example, some properties may not be suitable for heat pumps, so they would take a different upgrade path versus a home that would be suitable. Next, we used our PEAT software to model these scenarios for all 500,000 homes in the WICA housing stock. Next slide, please. So for each home, the results included a measure level output. So this showed each improvement recommended for a property and its corresponding cost and savings in terms of energy consumption, fuel bill, and CO2 emissions. It also included a property level output, which showed the total cost savings and energy efficiency impact. So essentially the improvement in EPC score for that full package of measures for each property. It also included a comparison of these outputs under each scenario. So you could see what measures were recommended and what the potential improvement would be under the regulatory standard scenario versus the high ambition scenario. So that kind of gives you a differential in terms of savings and costs. Now these PEAT outputs were then integrated into those Power BI dashboards I mentioned earlier that were developed in stage 1. So that enabled council users to cross-reference the data alongside their housing stock data. So they could go in, look at specific areas, they could look at properties that had certain characteristics, and then see what package of measures have been recommended for those properties under the 2 scenarios. It's very useful to kind of pull those 2 data sets back together. Next slide, please. So the final step in this stage involved translating the retrofit pathways to timeframes. So to do this, we applied a retrofit adoption curve and used some prioritization logic to phase the planned works from 2022 out to 2038. So basically aligning with WICA's net zero timeframe. This enabled us to model annual costs and savings, which helped to visualize the scale of the challenge over time. So you could see what years would likely require a certain level of investment, how much retrofit activity would have to be undertaken in a specific year. So very useful for understanding, again, that scale of challenge. And again, it's all assumption based, so that adoption curve could change as perception changes, as funding changes. It's really just following kind of standard S-shaped adoption curve, which we see with new technologies and innovation. So there'll be the early adopters, there'll be kind of a late majority that take up the measures, followed by a late majority, and then eventually the laggards, so the last ones, or in this case, maybe the hardest to treat properties or the most deprived that don't have the funds available to fund that retrofit. So this information was ultimately presented in a report to each council, and it really highlighted the unique opportunities and challenges for retrofit, and also provided some recommendations for achieving cost-effective home improvements in each council's area. Next slide, please. So the third stage involved creating a plan. And as I said, the format and approach to this plan, it often varies based on the local authority or social housing provider we're working with, depending on their goals and timeframes. In the case of WICA, we defined the plan as a retrofit pipeline, which would feature a hit list of property areas that aligned with relevant objectives that would inform action for the next 5 years for those councils. Next slide, please. So in collaboration with the steering group, we identified 7 priority interventions, which you can see on this slide here. For each intervention, we developed a logical framework that we could use to determine if a property was suitable for that intervention type. So for example, if a home was off the gas grid and in an affluent area, then it may have qualified as suitable for the no or lower grade heat pump installation intervention. Similarly, if we had a property that could be improved to EPC band C at a relatively low cost, then it may have qualified as suitable under the quick win intervention. Obviously, some of these interventions aren't mutually exclusive. So there were properties that qualified for multiple intervention types, and that was completely fine. It was really just it just really means that councils might have more flexibility in how they match those particular properties with different funding schemes that come down the line. And again, these intervention types could be changed, in a different local authority. Maybe there's different focus, but in the case of WICA, it was useful to kind of take a broad approach, because at that point they were still trying to decide which way they want to go, and depending on the funding that comes in, certain intervention types may be more or less relevant. So it was good to kind of cast a broad net in this case. Next slide, please. So once the interventions were established, we then used the housing stock data and the scenario modeling results from stage 1 and 2 to identify lower super output areas, or LSOAs, which had high concentrations of properties suitable for each intervention type. So you can see that in the first map there. There's a few hotspots for that. That map was just for one intervention, but you can imagine several maps for each of those intervention types. We then drilled down deeper into the LSOAs with those highest concentrations and identified relevant postcodes and streets worth targeting in the future. So that's really what the second graphic there is showing. We've drilled down into one of those LSOAs and shown a specific area and identified which properties would be eligible and which ones wouldn't be within that area. Now, for each project area, we also created a snapshot that summarized key attributes of the housing stock. So things like the property type, age, tenure, EPC band, and fuel poverty. So it's really just trying to give a summary of that area. We also summarized the costs and savings under each of those 2 scenarios we explored in that area, and signposted to relevant public and private funding options. So in some cases, homes in that area, based on the interventions being recommended, may have been suitable for the boiler upgrade scheme or social housing decarbonization fund, whatever it might have been. We kind of looked at the characteristics of the homes and again signposted to those schemes. Now, this work was ultimately presented in a report for each council as well, and the combined authority, to help inform where future funding bids and retrofit efforts could be focused. By including a range of potentially relevant intervention types in the analysis, it gave West Yorkshire councils more flexibility in how they approach retrofit in the future. So we know some funding schemes or demonstrators will require specific types of properties to be eligible. So having this, again, diverse pipeline helps to ensure the usefulness of the outputs over time. Next slide, please. So yeah, just to, I guess, wrap up, we delivered the initial project in 2022. And following that delivery, we actually completed a second phase of work. So we basically replicated the analysis for the other two WICA councils, so Leeds and Kirklees. As part of this work, we actually added a third scenario as well to the analysis. So we focused on, in that scenario, high payback fabric measures, as well as heat pumps and solar PV. So not quite as extensive as kind of the high ambition scenario we looked at in the first round of modeling, but maybe a more practical view of what could be done in a cost-effective way for homes. So again, there's always room to add more scenarios and again compare the outputs of them. And I think this project is really a great example of how a regional evidence base can be built up and enhanced over time as new funding becomes available. It also speaks to the benefits of having councils in the same area working from one consistent source of truth. Just makes it a bit easier to plan cross area schemes. Now that the initial data challenge has been addressed, we're starting to work with WICA to support the development of their Better Homes Hub, a program to scale up regional domestic retrofit. And this program encompasses all of the combined authorities' activity on domestic retrofit. So there's a vision that everyone in West Yorkshire can live in a warm, comfortable, and low carbon home. And that's what this program is supporting. Going forward, we'll continue to support WICA as a strategic advisor on this program. We're developing a 10-year delivery plan and also helping to design a regional one-stop shop for retrofit. So yeah, you can kind of see how this is built up over time from that initial evidence-based retrofit pathways. Now we're kind of into that plan phase and looking at other applications that are built off that kind of bedrock of data. So I hope this case study has been a useful kind of look under the hood in terms of how we can build solutions to tackle these complex challenges like decarbonization in practice, and also how we can scale them up over time. So I'll pass it back now to Nora. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean and Gordon. That was really helpful. Just going to head on to our next slide. So before moving on to the Q&A section, we wanted to let you know about our upcoming webinars. So here's a notice to let you know about our webinars happening on the 12th of March, HomeWise, our new digital tool. We're hosting a dedicated session for local authorities at 11 a.m. and a dedicated session for commercial organizations at 2 p.m. And in this webinar, we'll share insights from our experts about how to engage with their communities and customers on home energy efficiency advice and renewable technologies. To support this activity, we've developed a new digital tool called HomeWise. It's a way for you to offer your audience tailored retrofit advice. We'll discuss how HomeWise can support your ambitions in the webinar, as well as best practice examples of sharing home energy efficiency plans and much more. We hope to see you there, and there'll shortly be a link in the chat for you to register for the webinar that best suits your needs. So we will now move on to the Q&A section. And we've had a few questions already submitted, so we can address those first. Let's see, let me get those up now. All right. So the first questions that we've had submitted, this person would like to hear more about the approach to decarbonizing small sites, circa 10 flats, and also Victorian buildings in a conservation area. Gordon, do you think you can take this one?
Am I unmuted? Yeah, I'm unmuted now. Thanks, Nora. I'll certainly have a go. Talking about small flat sites at the current time, I've had this specific scenario in the past. It very much depends on where you're starting, but the thing I would say is, are you dealing with a block of properties that roll on a communal heating system already, or have they all got individual gas boilers at the current time? That's an immediate consideration. And then obviously, have you got district heating that's going either already in place, or is it going to be in place soon? Because these all affect what kind of solution you're looking at. A solution I looked at for the particular scenario I was looking at was, okay, it was about 10, 12 flats that I was looking at, small block, and they had a bit of a footprint of land around them. So the solution they all had at the current time, they had just panel heaters on the walls. So two things. First of all, it always remains right that you start looking at the fabric of the building. And that doesn't really matter whether it's a house in a street or it's a block. Looking at the fabric of the building, the particular heating solution I was looking at was ambient loop heat pump, which essentially you have boreholes and you pump round essentially ground temperature water, and then you draw, each property has its own mini heat pump that draws temperature out of that ambient loop. Now it's quite a good solution. Because they're boreholes, they don't actually take much land footprint. Once you've done the borehole, you cover it up again, you never even know it's there. The other thing to think is, if they've already got a central plant room, then you can look at moving to a low carbon source rather than, say, let's say it's a gas boiler in there at the current time. And so it might be going to a commercial type heat pump in that scenario. The other thing worth mentioning is, in terms of supporting reducing bills, you're almost certainly aware of the heat metering and billing regulations. And simply, if they're already on a communal system, tying it down to, getting heat meters into each property, so they're suddenly, rather than paying an average service charge for the heat they use, they're paying for the heat they use. And that can just change behaviours in its own right and drive down consumption, because it's not somebody else's problem, it's suddenly your own problem. So that's just a thought on those. Victorian buildings as conservation area, again, challenging. What I would say is, if they're in a conservation area, start those conversations with planning early. The way I've done it in the past has been recognizing those planning restrictions, using the solid wall buildings, so using IWI to the front of the building, internal wall insulation to the road facing side of the property, and the external wall insulation to the rear of the property, which tends to be where the kitchens and the bathrooms are, so you're not interfering too much with those. Again, I haven't seen this done yet, but I think these ambient loop heat pumps might be a good long-term solution for these fairly tight groups of terraces. So I hope that helps a little. And do you have anything to add on that, Sean?
No, I think you captured it all pretty well, Gordon.
Thank you.
Perfect. So we've had another question submitted, and I know we're a bit tight for time, so this might be the last question that we answer today. But the question is it still the thought that all buildings should be treated as fabric first when it comes to building improvements? Sean, can you take this one?
Yeah, I can take that one. I think the key word maybe there is all buildings. I think generally speaking, for most buildings, that is still the school of thought, that we want to improve the fabric before we start playing with the heating system. As Gordon was mentioning earlier, a heat pump's only going to be so effective if you've got leaky walls and the insulation isn't up to scratch. So I think that is the approach we would recommend for most properties. But there are that group of properties that are very costly to improve the fabric. So solid wall properties, for example, in certain circumstances will be prohibitively expensive to upgrade, or there could be some of these other planning considerations that Gordon was just discussing as well that might make it not feasible necessarily to do those fabric upgrades that you'd want to do. So in terms of looking at a kind of a full stock, I'd probably prioritize those which can more easily be upgraded in terms of their fabric, and probably deprioritize those which may need more unique solutions. And in those ones where a fabric first approach is too expensive, or maybe is too intrusive, it just isn't realistic. That's not to say you can't go to a heat pump or a low carbon heating system. It's just you're probably not going to want to go there right now. It's probably something to kind of wait a bit. When the costs are more economical in terms of the installation, but also the running costs, and as we see gas and electricity prices balance out, in the longer term, as the gas prices internalize more of the cost of carbon, we'd expect electricity prices to kind of drop in relative terms. So at that point, putting in a heat pump, even in a somewhat leaky home, may be a better approach than doing nothing to those properties. I don't know, Gordon, if you've got any other thoughts from your experience on Fabric
No,
First.
very much reflect what you're saying there. It's still whether or not you've got a gas boiler in there or you've got a heat pump in there, it still makes sense to preserve more of that heat in the first place. It doesn't really matter what the heat source is, it's going to cost you less, and particularly when you're dealing with customers that might struggle to pay their bills. You're preserving what you've got rather than changing how you get it. It's got to be the right thing to do.
Perfect. Well, that's been really helpful, and it looks like that's all we have time for today. But we thank you all for your time, and if we didn't get a chance to answer your question or you have any further questions, please fill out the form in the chat and we can get back to you as soon as possible. But thanks again for tuning in, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks everyone.
Good to meet you.